All right, welcome back to the FeelSwell Cultures podcast. I'm so excited that you're here. We've got a very special guest, Lotus Buckner. And Lotus, we've just already been talking a little bit before this podcast even started. We're going to have a great conversation today. And I know that there's so much that we're going to get into with intentional, meaningful leadership and give a shit, right? Like this
Yes.
terminology that you use. Like we're going to talk all about it. And you've had such an extensive experience in this world and working with so many people from around the world. So I'm really excited and so thankful that you're here today. Lotus, why don't you just give a little background from your perspective? Who are you?
Yes. Who am I? That's a great question. I would love to answer one day. well, I am Lotus Buckner, and I'm super excited to be here with you. I have led people and culture teams, HR teams throughout my career in various different industries that are very different from each other. So everything from thinking big corporate to tiny little startup and building HR from scratch, basically. So love doing that. And I am a soon-to-be author. So I will be publishing my first book as well in less than a month. And so that'll be all about how do we really take workplaces and HR departments and flip them on their heads, right? How do we just completely start from scratch and do this differently? Because I feel like that's where we are these days, where we just really need to start from scratch and build something that's really going to work and be more sustainable and get back to basics and really be able to support people to thrive in our workplaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, number one, congrats on the book. That is not something that is super easy to do. And your book is coming out, so hopefully we'll be able to link all of that. And can people pre-order the book?
We're not doing pre-orders, but we have a goal of 200 copies on day one. So day one
Okay.
launch team, you can sign up for anytime.
Okay, amazing. We'll put all of that in the show notes and the description. That way everyone can see. But yeah, this is great because you've had the experience. You've worked in many different kinds of organizations and you've seen what it really looks like. And now the world's changed. That's what we talk about all the time on FeelSwell Cultures. It's like I was a Gen Z employee and I saw that there was this shift and I watched my parents and I watched the ways that, the world around me had not done it very sustainably, and many were burning out, mental health, the health issues, like all the things that were happening. And now we're going, how do we flip that on its head? Right. And so
Yep.
for you talk about this idea of intentional, or what you say, give a shit leadership. What is
Yes.
that? Like, what do you mean by that? And why is that coming to the surface for you right now? And how is it showing up?
Yeah, so when I started my career, and especially when I took my first leadership role, right, everybody was talking about what's your leadership style, and there were all of these different leadership styles that really put people in a box of what kind of leader they are. And I always found that problematic. So, I would try to adopt one of them, and it's like it never felt genuine, it never felt
Mm,
authentic. And when I really think about, as now that I've done this for so long, and I think back about what were the times where I was really successful as a leader, and what were those commonalities? And it all came down to giving a shit, right? It's about leading very purposefully. So it means consciously exemplifying behaviors that will create positive impacts for people and initiatives that you lead. It's about essentially leading on purpose. It's not leading because you have to or because you have some fancy job title, but rather because you feel like you care about the people that you're leading, right?
mhm.
It's why I feel like the lack of leadership is such a crisis in today's workplaces. We throw around management titles and we build these complex vertical hierarchies, but we don't have people in place who actually are leading people anymore.
I think you're spot on with that. I've done a lot of research, and when I talk to people, I say, where are you now? What job are you at? Or why did you leave? And time again, it's because of the manager or the people. It's hardly ever about the job,
Right?
and
Yep.
that is a constant theme that I've seen over and over again. I experienced it myself. And you see that with the intentional and like show somebody that you care, there's this whole other side. right? So what's an example of, and maybe some of the CEOs or HR professionals that are listening here today, like what is an example that maybe they can point out in their day-to-day life or something that you've seen where you're like, okay, this is me giving a shit. This is me showing up in this way. Is there something specific that you have even exemplified yourself?
There's so many stories I could tell. A quick one that I also talk about in my book is like I said, when I was earlier in my leadership career, I went with like whatever I was taught, best practices, right? And I was always told it's important that you're holding regular one-on-ones, that you hold regular meetings with your team members. So I always did that, right? I'd have new team members or I'd take on a new team and that's the first thing I would do. I'd schedule all these meetings and I'd have all these regular check-ins with them. And I remember one of my employees after a few months was like, Lotus, why do I have to meet with you every single week? Like, why do we have to check in once a week? It just doesn't feel productive. This was a business partner, and she was like, my office is in the hallways. Like, I work a lot of hours. I'm on call basically 24/7. And I want work-life balance. I want to be able to get more work done during the day. But every single week, like I lose an hour or more if we go over, right? Because we have this meeting and there, we catch up and we get to know each other better. And I update you on all my progress, but it doesn't work for me. Like I want that hour back. I'm somebody who I like to get stuff done when I need it done. And I have no problem reaching out to you when I need help with something. And I don't want to wait until we have a one-on-one in order for me to ask questions and be able to move forward with my work. And I'm happy to put my updates in an email, right? Like you know how to, you can read it. And I was like, I just remember sitting there like stunned. Like that is such a basic thing and a basic concept, but I had been operating under what I was taught. Like you just have to have all these check-ins and they have to be regular and you have to treat every single team member the same. And I was like, you're right. What do you want to do? Do you want to just have ad hoc meetings? Do you want to move it to monthly? And so I asked all my team members then after that, and ongoing till this day, that's how I operate is I talk to each person and see what works for them rather than operating by what was taught to me as best practice, which sounds amazing, right? Like best practice, everyone wants to follow that, right? But I'm actually realizing that that's a lot of the problems that we run into is we're always just unconsciously almost following what these best practices are, and we're not thinking about if that's actually the right way to do something.
That's such a powerful story. And in those moments, I feel like you could potentially take that personally and be like, oh, they don't want to meet with me, right? So if you're a leader in that situation, how do you take that? And talking about being more intentional, like what are those steps and how do you take yourself out of it to be able to really meet someone where they are?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to giving a shit, right? Like I think if we had more people in these leadership roles that had a more balanced approach, right, which is one of the methods that I talk about, rather than just having your eye on the money, we have to have that balance. Like, yes, you can't run a business without people. And you can't run a business without money. I get that too, right? Like you can't just hire a million people and then put your business under. But there has to be a better balance because that just doesn't exist right now. And so I think that if we take more pauses as leaders, and just like you said, instead of taking things personally, we all like to believe, right, that we are amazing at receiving feedback, but how many of us really are, right? When we think about it, right, we would be in a different place right now if we were all better at that. And so I think just taking more pauses is something I always encourage people to do, is really doing that inner work, that holistic self-reflection, which is another one of the methods that I talk about, is becoming extremely self-aware, because then you won't take things as personally. You can take those pauses more easily. You can really hear what another person is saying to you and what they're trying to tell you, right? This is somebody who had been on my team for quite a while, and I even knew this person before they were an employee of mine. We were in the same organization in different roles and different departments. And so we've known each other for a while. I had to pause in that moment and say, they're giving me some very critical, important feedback that could really change the trajectory, not just of our relationship, but of the success of our entire team and all initiatives that we're going to be putting out.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, going back to the pause, right? If someone's in that situation in that moment, is there a question that they can ask themselves? Like, what would you ask yourself in that moment? Is there something they can say, while they're paused, right? Because we could be paused, but we could be fiery and heated up and, just like, wow, this is about me. What is that question that can guide them back to intentional give a shit leadership? If there
Well,
is.
yeah, I think so. If anyone has been trained in improv, I love the concept of yes and.
Yeah.
I think that the more we can shift our mindset there, so the question is really about, right? Yes, this person is giving me some really critical feedback. Yeah, acknowledge your feelings about it too, right? Like acknowledge the fact that maybe, okay, that didn't feel great to receive that. I'm feeling a little bit offended. I'm feeling a little defensive, whatever that feeling might be, acknowledge it, right? Because it's okay for us to feel those things. I think that's stigmatized, but it's okay for us to have whatever feeling it is that we have when we receive feedback. So acknowledging that, recognizing it, allowing yourself to sit with that, taking that pause, and then asking, what is this person really trying to tell me? And how
Mhm.
could it work? Rather than where we usually go is the but approach, the no but approach, right? Which is all the reasons why their idea or their feedback is never going to work, and that it's inappropriate, right? Shifting our mindset to say, let me listen to what they're really saying and how can I add to that? How can we make this work?
Yeah, I love that. It's like this idea of what is this person really trying to tell me? Because I
Yeah,
think our nervous system can respond. Maybe we've
for
been told
sure.
something like that before, or we've been, in a sense, it can almost feel like you're rejected, right?
Yep.
But we, as the leader or being leaders and trying to show up in this way and doing the best we can, it's taking that moment and saying, like you said, Lotus, what is this person really trying to tell me? And then I think that extension that we could probably get into and talk about all day long is like, how do you have empathy for that person? How do you
Yeah.
step into their shoes? And this person's telling you in your story, I've got X amount of things to do, and I need that hour for these things. And how do you understand that and put yourself in that situation? Like, if that was me and I needed to get that done, would it be more helpful? But I think something that we should definitely talk about is that people may not think that it's really fair, that we don't have that kind of leadership style for every single person, right? You're meeting different people where they're at, and sometimes it can be different treatment, right? Or different ways that they show up, or they don't have to attend something. Like, how do we establish a culture where everyone's on the same page, that we meet people where we are, we listen to people, and we create bridges, not barriers?
I think you're absolutely right. And I do think that we have to shift our mindset because for a long time, we had a management style that operated in fair is equal, right? Like treat everyone the same, very compliance driven, right? If you treat
Yeah.
everyone the same, you can't get in legal trouble, which is not true, first of all. But second of all, isn't the right way to approach things. We're living in an era of pandemics, social unrest, natural disasters, political divide, mass layoffs, economic confusion, and so much more. Like it just has been so overwhelming lately. And I think the choice has been made for us that we have to do things differently. And I think it's crystal clear now that the world of work needs a major overhaul and we can't treat people all the same. Like these are humans we're talking about. Like no one person is like another. And so the fact that we've been treating them all the same, thinking that was the right way to approach things, I think is pretty problematic. So like I said, fair is not always equal. If people don't start in the same place, for example, it's not fair to expect them to now be treated equally as others and have them reach the same levels of success when they weren't privy to the same resources, tools, experiences. We really have to start customizing and personalizing our styles, our approaches, and our solutions to individuals.
Mhm.
I think that, there's a lot of conversations about DEI that's happening and mental health, right, in the workplace. And how do we finally make some movement in these two spaces? Because I think it's something we've talked about for so long and tried so many different strategies. And either those professionals in those areas, those departments get a lot of pushback, don't get the right resources given to them, right? They're always part of those mass layoffs. How do we start moving beyond equality? We need to move towards equity. That means it's not about treating everyone the same anymore, which is what I was taught when I first entered the workplace. But it's really about how do we really look at people as whole humans who are completely unique, and how do we design our workplaces so that we can provide them a sense of belonging while still cultivating success for the company, right? And that's what I always like to think about this as personalization and customization. So we talk about those words in business, right? It's easy when we talk about personalization and customization when it comes to like product management and product development. Well, use that same concept and apply it to the people in your company. Personalizing our leadership style means that we're understanding our team's needs and ensuring that we're designing the right environment to nurture those needs. Customization is about being open to what you do not know and being flexible to allowing your team members to pull what they need from you. And so it's the same as when you're talking about it in a business mindset. You know, personalization is the push and customization is the pull.
Yeah, I love that. Personalization. I think that the customization piece is something that we miss. Being open to what you don't know. Like we often assume that we're just like, oh, but I assumed that I knew that this person would want to, have this setup or have it this way. And I think, it's something that we're looking at in so many different aspects, because I say all the time, when I'm speaking at different conferences and I'm talking about managing Gen Z and millennials in the workforce, and I'm explaining my story of why I left. If someone would have looked at me and said, I'm just going to meet you where you are, and I'm not going to put you into a box, and we're going to really listen to you, I wouldn't be an entrepreneur.
Yep.
Like I became an accidental entrepreneur because of the leadership styles that forced me into this box and wanted me to be this certain way and didn't support my growth.
And your story is so common now.
It's so common. And I think that's what people miss. And that's what I hope a lot of the HR professionals and leaders are listening to today, is that like you said, all these things that we're experiencing right now, things are changing. It is not the same. 58% of the workforce in the next 5 years will be Gen Z and millennials. Boomers are leaving 10,000 every week, right? We've got this major transition in the multi-generational workforce. And 40% of that 58 that I just shared, they want to leave their current role because of burnout.
Isn't that wild?
I mean, that right there has got to stay. Something's got to shift. The future of work has to look differently. And I think you're so right, Lotus. Like, it goes back to these people. And how can these people, show up and take care of themselves and also meet people where they are, and customize the way that we support the people around us. So what is one way, if you could just pull out something that's powerful, maybe that you see? I mean, you're working with people every day, day to day, you're seeing these different scenarios. What's one thing that you think would be really helpful for our listeners about how they can become a more intentional leader?
So I'll actually give you 5. So I talk about this in my upcoming book, but there's 5 things that I talk about in being a guide to becoming a more intentional leader. And I say that because I'm such a big believer that there's no such thing as an exhaustive list, and there's no perfect recipe for success. If we had those things, we wouldn't be talking, right?
True.
We wouldn't have the issues that we have. And so I really want to emphasize that these are 5 things that I really consider a great guide to get you started. The first thing is holistic self-reflection. So I talked a little bit about that, but that's really about becoming really self-aware, because I think when you can do that, you can center yourself better, you can take those pauses better. So taking the time to do some holistic self-reflection, that's not about like, what are my strengths and what, it's really diving deep and understanding who you are, how you react to situations. What are those things that make you, right, your blood boil? What are those things that initiate your nervous system? And really knowing yourself in that way. Number 2 is thinking, acting, and hiring differently. So as leaders, how are we thinking differently? Not just relying on best practice. Not that best practice is a bad thing. It exists for a reason, right? It works for a lot of people, but best practice is never going to stand the test of time. Best practice 10 years ago is no longer best practice today, right? So how can we start thinking differently and then acting differently, right? Because those two go hand in hand. How do we then execute on that? And then that third part of that one is, how do we hire differently? How do we get past similarity bias? How do we hire different than we do today? And how do we build these teams that are going to thrive and be sustainable, right? Regardless of what's going on in the world. How do we look at those few companies, because it's very rare, that made it through COVID, that made it through the social unrest, that made it through all the economic troubles very successfully, right? And still maintain strong cultures. While it's rare, it's possible. And so how do we do that? And then number 3 is feedback and conflict. So how can we think about feedback and conflict differently? I shared that story about when I received some feedback. So how do we become more open to feedback, not just saying that we're open and like saying, yes, I heard you, thank you for your feedback, right? Because that's how it usually plays out.
Yeah. Push it to the side.
Exactly, right? That's the courteous thing to say and how we respond. But how do we actually invest ourselves in feedback and conflict and use that yes and approach? Number 4 is customization and personalization, which I won't repeat myself when we talked a lot about, but how do we do that push and pull as a leader like we would in our business when we're developing a product? How do we make sure that we're pushing the right information out, and how do we make sure that we're pulling the right information in so that our teams can thrive? And then the last one is just having a balanced approach. And so that also ties into the yes and approach, but really about making sure that we're striking that right balance at the right times, right? Because sometimes you have a giant business initiative going on, and that's going to take a little bit more, right? But then how do we rebalance that to make sure that our people are taken care of? And so that there's no perfect formula, right? It's not like 50-50 all the time, but how do we make sure that we're paying attention to having a balanced approach in our leadership?
I love it. Those are so helpful. And I like that you describe them as not, this is the like exact method you need to follow, but this is a guide, because we're going to take bits and pieces from our experiences. We're going to take pieces from, something someone did or something taught us. And we're like, oh, we thought this was that. I mean, Lotus, this is what you walked into, and you've had to recreate what this guide looks like for yourself based on what you've been given. So everyone's coming from a completely different foundation. And I think when we can take pieces that we go, oh, I like that, and I want to use this as a part of my guide, like that can be really helpful. And I love your approach in that. And I think anyone that's listening today, like, can soak that in. Like, I would say, if I were you, get your pen and notebook out and go back and rewind this and take those 5 things and see, hey, can I hold myself accountable and actually implement this? One thing I always think about when I'm listening to podcasts or I'm taking in new information or I'm trying to improve in some area of my life is like, I can sit here and I can listen on the car ride or wherever I'm headed or whatever I'm doing or on a walk. But if I don't actually take the time to figure out how I'm going to implement it, it's really not going to matter. So I think what you're sharing today is pure gold, and people will feel like so connected to it, because it's not something that, is cookie cutter that they just need to do and stamp on and have be a part of their entire lives. It's what
would it like be so easy if we could all just do that? I always chuckle a little bit when I see those types of posts or those comments that are made, because I just always look and I'm like, if it was that easy, we wouldn't have these problems.
You've seen the Southern bathrooms that they've got all the signs, live, laugh, love. You know what I mean? Like, we all just want to live, laugh, love, but it's not always live, laugh, love. So I love what you shared today, and I just so appreciate your expertise, your knowledge. You are an absolute joy to talk to. I could interview you for hours, and we could just keep going. Maybe we'll have to do another episode. We'll talk more. But
Anytime, anytime.
yeah, I think it's really powerful, and I loved what you shared today. And I hope the listeners can really hone in and just use this as a guide. Lotus, if there's one more thing that maybe that's on your heart today from our conversation that you'd want to share before we wrap up here, is that, a quote? Is that something that's just on your mind from the conversation? What would that be?
I just think it's so important to not be stagnant in our leadership approaches and our approach to life, really, right? This isn't just about work. Like these things apply to life too.
Mhm.
We have to be able to be agile. We have to be able to be flexible because things are always changing. And so the more we can do that and operate under that approach and make that really our default and our habit, I think the more success will come our way because the all of these, even the approaches I talked about today, right? Like you can talk to me in a year, 2 years, 5 years, and I'll probably have tweaked those,
Mhm.
right? For the times. And so the only thing that doesn't change that I can say definitively will bring success is if you give a shit, which
Mm.
is why I believe in intentional leadership. If you care enough, it doesn't matter what times you're in, if it's successful times, if it's hard times, if you care enough to start thinking, to having this mindset shift about what can I do? What is that yes and approach? Then I really think that you can be successful. So I think that's the only stagnant thing that we can do.
I love that. I love it so much. It just boils down our whole conversation into that little piece there of just give a shit. Like as simple as it is, right? There's so much that we can figure out and use as a guide for ourselves. But remember that phrase. I'm gonna write that down and just have a sticky note because it's easy to get caught up, It's easy to get caught up in day-to-day to-do lists and emotions and feelings. Why the heck do we have those? But we do. So, I appreciate that. Lotus, where can people connect with you? Where can they find you? I know we're going to link all of it below, but if you just want to say it here too, that way they can get connected and, of course, get the book.
Yes, absolutely. Well, my website is talentremix.com and everyone can find me, Lotus Buckner, on LinkedIn. Do send me a little message so that I know that you heard through the podcast because there is a lot of spam out on LinkedIn and I have a lot to clean up still. So
I love it. I love it. That's amazing. We'll link all of it below. Again, thank you so much for your knowledge, your time. I know that you condensed it into about 20 minutes here, but that didn't take 20 years to learn all, or 20 minutes to learn all of that. So I really appreciate everything you shared and just keep spreading your light. You're a joy to talk to, and we'll see everybody on the next episode.